If you'll take your seat, we'll get started. I'm Melissa O'Sullivan with the Danube Institute. I want to welcome you all here this morning. Thank you very much for coming. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Barbara Kohlm from the Austrian Center in Vienna and the entourage to follow with the Free Market Roadshow. This represents the 11th year that we've been the Budapest partner for the roadshow. And now I'd like to introduce Philip Pilkington, who is our in-house economist, macroeconomist, and he's going to take it away. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome to the Free Market Roadshow, coming live from the Danube Institute in Budapest. May you live in interesting times, says the apparent Chinese curse relayed by Chamberlain. I don't think it was actually a Chinese curse. We might say, may you prepare a panel in interesting times. As of yesterday, the Trump administration seems to have frozen its tariffs on China. In response, the gold market has sold off. Since our two morning sessions are on gold and tariffs respectively, that makes our jobs as moderators and panelists all the more interesting. Despite the fact that we all seem to be having to fundamentally update our intellectual software multiple times a week, there is something to be said for the pace at which we are all being forced to operate, that is as exhilarating as it is annoying. My panelists may disagree with me, but I take the view that what happened on Liberation Day is a genie that cannot easily be put back in its bottle. Humpty Dumpty has fallen off a wall and no one is quite sure what to do. Understood correctly, the trade war has now been ongoing for nearly a decade, and the status of the US dollar has been in question since financial sanctions were imposed on Russia. And so, if I am in any way correct, I do not think that our chosen topics of conversation have been rendered obsolete by the latest gnomic utterance from President Trump's Truth Social account. Do we believe that the latest move of the White House vis-à-vis the Chinese has put the trade and monetary question to rest, and that we are to return to those halcyon days of the so-called great moderation? I, for one, do not. The most recent issue of The Economist, I think it's out this week, disagrees with this assessment. It features a battered and bruised American eagle with the title, "Only 1,361 days left to go." The Economist, it must be said, is currently locked into an existential struggle with the forces of history, and so in some sense the editorial board is, as we used to say in markets, talking its own book. Nevertheless, there are some people who think that what is happening in the world economy today is the work of one man in Washington, D.C. Here is me thinking that English literature graduates are taught about the dangers of anthropomorphizing impersonal historical and economic forces, but some cannot help themselves. Trump derangement syndrome has mutated from an epidemic of hysteria in the first administration to the opiate of choice for the globalist masses in the second. Having had access to a smartphone these past few years, it truly surprises me that people as discerning as the editors of The Economist magazine failed to notice the enormous changes that were taking place during the Biden administration. A cynic might say that this is the result of enormous political polarization that's taken hold in Western societies, and that this polarization itself is accelerating the changes that are taking place, principally because it doesn't really allow us to discuss those changes. But regardless of what accounts for this strange delirium, let's try to be honest. These changes have been a long time coming. For years, some economists, we might distinguish them as being the ones not invited to Davos, have been sounding the alarm that developed economies of the Western world were on a dangerous path. Central banks were printing money like there was no tomorrow, and major economies like the United States and the United Kingdom were sending these banknotes abroad to prop up enormous trade deficits. Marxists and dissident Keynesians, shrieked that Western countries were having their industrial capacity hollowed. Austrians screamed that the fiat money-backed debt that was being issued in huge quantities would eventually come due. Money men on Wall Street snickered as people they considered odd ducks counselled to buy gold. Well, my Wall Street friends, who is snickering now? This is less Trump, more Gotterdammerung. The old gods are fading into the background and no one is really sure what new gods are about to emerge. We will soon find out. In this morning's session of the Free Market Roadshow, we'll be tackling two of the key issues raised by these enormous global trends. In the first session, we will tackle gold and the US dollar. Are the enormous moves in the gold market signaling something about the future of the US dollar? In the second session, we will grasp the nettle on trade and tariffs and ask, in retrospect, why did the Trump administration overshoot with their tariffs policy? So we'll be starting with a panel on the dollar and gold, and I'll be introducing Dr. Barbara Kolm, founder of the Free Market Roadshow and director of the Austrian Economics Center, and Dr. Dan Mitchell, who's a public policy economist. If you guys will please come up. Thank you very much. Are we good? Thank you for coming on the panel this morning. So, as I said, the first panel is on the US dollar and gold, which is a bit of a hot topic at the moment. The gold price is now somewhere between $3,200 and $3,400 an ounce, which I think when I used to work in financial markets, if you said you'd been called a crazy gold bug. But it doesn't seem so crazy anymore. So I guess we could maybe start by asking what your broad views of the gold rally are and of what it means for the US dollar. Perhaps we'll start with Dr. Kohn.
Well, gold crisis. Whenever you have crisis, gold prices go up. And this is evident. We have seen that over the past decades. But from an Austrian perspective, I think we also need to look at our currencies. And you mentioned at your opening remarks trade and what Trump has done with his shock, actually, to bring down the stock markets and to stop the bond markets. I assume there was a good reason for that, since you know that you have to refinance U.S. debt. And I think until June 30th or 31st, 1/3 of it. And so there must be a reason why he wanted the markets to kind of collapse or at least go down. So for those who held gold, this was a good thing and a good issue. One thing. Second thing, petrodollar. I think the age of the petrodollar is more or less kind of wading out. Third thing, we have to look into central bank digital currencies, which is, from an Austrian economics perspective, a huge danger and a big trick. I mean, for you here in Hungary, you at least have your forint in your constitution and you have cash still in your constitution, whereas other European countries don't have that. And the ECB is pushing towards a digital euro, which is, from an Austrian economics perspective, a huge danger. So what alternatives are there? Gold as one, silver, other tangible metals maybe. But I think gold will see a rise in the next couple of months still. And it's good if you have invested in gold.
No doubt, as anyone who's holding gold knows. Dr. Mitchell, your broad thoughts on recent moves in gold and the US dollar and so on?
Historically, the U.S. has been a safe haven for people. If you're worried about events in your country or around the world, you invest in the U.S. And specifically, you might want to invest in U.S. treasuries, government debt of the United States, seen as very safe. But I think one of the reasons why we've seen a spike in gold prices is the U.S. not only has a trade policy that is destabilizing the global economy, but we also have such enormous deficits and debt that you might be thinking, if you're a rich person, rich company, you're trying to park some money someplace, you might think, well, maybe the U.S. is no longer that safe haven for the world, and so why not put your money in gold, especially if you think other assets might be overvalued and there might be a coming decline in either stock or bond prices. So I think it's just people being prudent and cautious around the world, combined with the fact that governments are making life a little bit more challenging for people in the economy.
And do both of you see this as a fundamental shift, or do you think it's a nervousness currently?
I think the entire world, also currency, fabric, and monetary policy is changing, and there are shifts there, definitely. If you look back what happened almost 1.5 years ago, when the BRICS came up and said they wanted to tie their new whatever currency to gold, and peg it with gold. We all knew that that's an interesting idea, but the tensions between the BRICS and the new members of BRICS were way too big that this would be a reasonable idea. But still, going out with that and announcing that made certain central bankers nervous. And you saw central banks buying up gold all over the place, whether it was the Chinese who bought a lot of gold, but also European central banks tried to get their gold reserves back to their respective countries. Germany, for example, announced like 3 weeks ago that they wanted to bring their gold back from the U.S. back to Frankfurt, respectively, to Frankfurt, and so there is a. How do you say a desire to hold gold as a safe haven. On the same side, monetary policy and fiscal policy have mixed up totally. There is no barrier between those two policies. Beforehand, it was separate. Monetary policy didn't intervene in fiscal policy, at least in Europe. And then, as a result of 2008 crisis, Frankfurt and Brussels is totally closed, and they are adapting and making sure that they go parallel. So instead of being separate and independent, and that's a big shift and a new tendency that we've seen over the past 15, almost 20 years now.
Yeah, I think highlighting the fact that it's not exclusively state actors that are driving the demand for gold right now, but they are a huge component of the market. And there was another really interesting shift where a lot of the gold from London that was being held on futures contracts, so it was paper gold, but in theory there was gold behind it. It was flowing back to the US, and actually some of the tariff policies seemed designed to do that, which was a really fascinating quirk in Treasury policy.
But that also had something to do with Brexit and with London not being the financial hub of Europe anymore.
Yeah, I think it may spell the end of the city. I think they may end up looking back on those gold flows as one of those historical moments that you read about in economic history books. Dr. Mitchell, do you see this as a big structural shift in the global monetary architecture, or do you think it's just a panic for trying times and global chaos and so on?
I think there are two things that we should be paying attention to. One, building on what Barbara just said, there's a theory called fiscal dominance, which is the notion that central banks will, in effect, subjugate themselves to the political system by financing government budget deficits. And deficits and debt are so enormous in many Western nations that it's no surprise that people in financial markets are wondering about whether monetary policy will be inflationary in the future. I think the risks are all pointing in that direction. But there's another issue that I think is going on or playing a behind-the-role scene. A lot of people don't like the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. Some countries don't like it because they're geopolitical adversaries to the United States. Some countries don't like it because the U.S. is very aggressive and using the dollar's role to enforce sanctions and extraterritoriality and our financial regulations and financial laws. And some people, like the BRICS, just want to be a competitor. Being the world's reserve currency carries with it a quote-unquote exorbitant privilege, as I think it was Mitterrand who said. And the U.S. is sort of helping them by not being fiscally and monetarily responsible, but it's such a huge challenge to displace a reserve currency. There have only been two reserve currencies in world history, the British pound and then the dollar. And as much as I don't like some of the actions of the U.S. government, what's going to take the place of the dollar? It's not going to be the Chinese RMB. Who's going to trust Beijing? The euro, I thought, would have been a good competitor, but I think, as Barbara pointed out, when this ECB sacrificed its independence to do bailouts, now there's just a lot less trust in the euro. People would love to have the Swiss franc, except it's too small. So we're in an era where people don't like the dollar as the world's reserve currency, but I'm not really sure there's an alternative that's practical.
Well, exactly, that's the point. So far, there is no alternative, despite the fact that also the US does not know anymore what sound money is. And I think this is the biggest challenge for everyone, that we have come up with ideas that, just printing our debt away will help and will solve problems. No, it does not. As a matter of fact, it increases the problems, and structural reforms need to be done once you're frugal and once you have your budgets at bay, which none of those states that we were talking about have. It's whether the US nor any European state that has their household in order, or European Union states, I should say, especially the Western European Union states, that don't have their households at bay. And so they try to find alternatives, and one of them would be the central bank digital currency, given that it's programmable. And if we look what is happening now with the trilogue, which means that the European Commission has given the marching orders, put it this way, to the ECB to start the entire legal process, to start the programming, do everything, and it has to be ratified in one of the next by the next end of this year, actually. Luckily, the next chairing of the EU will also be from a non-Euro country. Right now, the Poles have it. Next chair will be by Denmark, who don't have the euro as well. So we can postpone this until the first of, at least until Cyprus will chair the EU. And so we have a time window in order to be able to prevent the digital euro, or at least kick it down the road for another while, because I don't think that this is either money, nor is it sound, nor is it the task of a central bank to produce something that is totally that would outperform and outcompete private digital monies. And it's not the task of the central bank to do that. And it's dangerous because it's programmable, and we could have currency reforms at any day as soon as this is operating.
And Barbara, let me just add something to that. In my mind, when I think of central bank digital currencies, it's really not central bank digital currencies, it's governments wanting to abolish cash, because if you abolish cash, when Barbara's talking about programmable, it basically means that government can come in and impose negative interest rates, steal your money if you don't go out and spend it like a good little Keynesian, or freeze your money if you're doing something politically incorrect, like Justin Trudeau did to the truckers who were protesting during COVID. So central bank digital currencies, if it means, as it probably does mean, eliminating cash, is a huge ceding of power to governments. And if you don't trust governments fully, and I certainly don't, that's a very, very risky idea.
Yeah, I kind of, if the idea is to shore up the confidence in a currency, we talked about this last year at the Roadshow, I don't really see installing spyware on your money as being a very credible means to do so. But maybe come back to the alternatives in a moment. So I just want to give maybe some sense of what's going on in markets. I don't live there anymore, but I sometimes check in. What's happened at the moment is that I think one of you alluded to it in your comments actually, that in the past, if there's chaos going on, money tends to flow back to the United States. And so it's been this funny privilege, well, we'll talk about if it's privilege or not, but that if there's tough economic times or if there's turmoil, borrowing costs would go down in the United States. And the way that basically worked was they'd generally be correlated to the US dollar, so the US. But at the moment, borrowing rates are actually rising, So it seems that from a financial markets point of view, something's broken in the hegemonic U.S. reserve currency system, and it seems to have taken place mainly since Liberation Day. But I suppose, with that in mind, what are your opinions on the U.S. having a reserve currency? Do you think it's a positive thing for the U.S. and for the world, or do you think it's a negative thing? Whoever wants to.
Well, sorry. We've had the dollar as a reserve currency for a very long time, and we've trusted in it until other forms came up, and the U.S. was not the leader of the world anymore, or is not the leader of the world anymore. And some people still have it in mind, but the world has changed. There is a new world order around. Asia is rising. Europe is going down. Unfortunately, we have to admit that. There are no balances anymore. So there will have to be a new form. Whether it's the dollar again, I doubt it. But I could not answer what it might be.
But do you think that the reserve currency... so there's a big debate in DC at the moment about whether the reserve currency is a good thing or not. It's kind of leaking into the public through White House statements and so on. But it's clear that behind the scenes, people are asking, was having the dollar hegemony actually good for the US, or was it a negative? What's your broad view on that?
I'll throw in a couple of comments. First of all, there's only maybe 1/100th of 1% of people in Washington who even know what a reserve currency is, and the dollar plays that role. So you're basically talking a few people at the Fed and a few people at the U.S. Treasury Department, and maybe a couple of academics. It's just amazing how few people understand or appreciate this. But generally speaking, those people all see it as a good thing. And from the perspective of the world, is the U.S. doing a better job than the British did? I don't know. When the British were the world's reserve currency, it was mostly during the era of the classical gold standard, and that was generally a very good period, and the British Central Bank did a good job of overseeing that. So I guess the British did a better job, but was it because their central bank was better than the Fed, or was it because we had the sort of constraints of the classical gold standard limiting the misbehavior of politicians? I suspect that the gold standard played a pretty big role back then.
So do you think that... So the US had a reserve currency that was backed by gold until 1971, at least in theory. Do you think that after that broke down, that led to governance issues in the US? Do you think it was negative for the world? Or?
Yes, it definitely loosened up the restrictions, and people just simply, politicians simply didn't stick to the rules anymore and didn't care. That was it.
Yeah, whether you think of it in terms of the constraints of at least a theoretical gold standard until 71, or whether you just think of it as
1913,
whether you think of it as James Buchanan's unwritten constitution, something has happened to erode sort of the norms of being fiscally and financially responsible. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not very optimistic about the long run. We have 100% plus of GDP debt in the U.S., and there's zero sign of that slowing down, and the aging of our population. This is a problem, by the way, in all European countries as well. We have welfare states predicated on big generations of future workers and few old people, and that population pyramid is turning into a cylinder. And we're all heading toward a fiscal cliff that's going to be disastrous, because for the most part, our politicians are kicking the can down the road. So, if you want to wallow in despair and pessimism, I'm with you.
Well, this is exactly why I meant structural reforms are much needed. And if you look at the balance sheet of the ECB, they're just reducing it from the APP programs, which were started in 2012, by 30 billion per month, and that's nothing. And then they had built the huge amount with the PEP programs, and they cannot reduce the balance sheets that fast, but they should. because it's totally non-sensible policy, monetary policy. They intervened, they pursued things that they should not have done. They did not stick to their mandate. The ECB didn't stick to the mandate, and they now try to get a new mandate with the central bank digital currency in order to hide all the old mistakes, which, is a disaster for all individuals and for our freedom.
The Europeans are currently getting a pass in the markets. Goldman Sachs put out a report yesterday or the day before saying that they expected euro to continue to rise. So the dollars, the problems in the dollar right now are giving the ECB, it appears, some room. How long it'll last, I don't know. Because at the same time, of course, they want to spend big on reconstruction for Ukraine, spending on more militarization and so on. And this is, I think, will make the previous federalized spending programs pale in comparison. Do you think that these discussions are taking... So there is some indication that these discussions are taking place in DC. We only see little drips of it, and then the Treasury pulls it back when they realize that people are getting wind of it. I think Stephen Moran put something up on the White House website, and there was a kind of a collective panic when he started talking about the reserve currency. But do you think that it's being discussed elsewhere in the world? I mean, clearly it's being discussed in the countries that are buying the gold, but what about elsewhere in the Western world, especially Europe and Australia and Britain and all these countries?
Well, those things are definitely not discussed at the ECOFIN, where they should be discussed, or in other institutions, both in Brussels and Frankfurt, because there are only Keynesians there. There are very few politicians of reason and of understanding, especially when it comes to ministers of finance, because why would they have put a ceiling on how to on cash withdrawal, for example, or on the use of cash? I mean, this is totally nonsense, and it's nothing that has anything to do with politics. It's just controlling individuals, controlling their citizens, and nothing else. So it's wrong politics, wrong policies, and definitely those things are not discussed in political circles. They should be discussed there. But if you have many uninformed politicians who don't understand the difference between sound money and what we have these days, then we end up where we are.
Yeah. Just to add to that quickly, I saw Spain this week announced that they were imposing up to 150,000 euro fines if you can't explain money that you took out over 3,000 euro.
No, if you withdraw from your own bank account your own money that you have saved or paid taxes for, etc., more than 3,000 euros, you have to ask the Ministry of Finance ahead of time, 24 hours in advance, if you are allowed to withdraw from your own account. And if you don't get the permission, then and you still do it, you are fined and end up with problems. I mean, this mistrust from the politicians to the individual is, I think, the most problematic things that we face these days. All those politicians believe that we are crooks. I mean, this is totally not acceptable. And Spain is currently doing that. And the French are doing the same things, not to this level. They are just sticking with 10,000 K, but it's
how generous.
It will be bad. We've seen the issues in Cyprus during the crisis when all of a sudden the cash machines were dead and you could not get to your own money. So the tendency of this mistrust, politicians towards their own citizens, is the issue. And
but by the way, in Australia, if you want to withdraw 1,000 Australian dollars or more, you have to tell the bank what you plan to do with the money. There's actually a very funny video of a guy going and giving fake reasons just to see whether the tellers will be shocked.
I'd add kind of an irony to that. Again, a report that said recently the European Court of Auditors, who are tasked with, I suppose they're supposed to check. They're the person who checks that they're spending the money correctly. and they came out with a report on, I think it was the big stimulus program around the pandemic. I can't recall the name of it. And they basically said that there was zero transparency. No one knew where any of the money went. So people aren't allowed to take out more than $3,000 in case you misspend your money. But at the top level, there's absolutely no accountability. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable system.
And then you wonder why you end up with those tons of regulations and rules that you have to fulfill, also from the financial industry. I mean, you just end up signing papers and working through your compliance issues, and it's unproductive time and doesn't help anybody.
Philip, can I go back to the question you asked about whether other countries are factoring in what's happening in the U.S.? That's an impossible task because I don't think the Trump administration knows necessarily what it's doing. When the tariffs were first being unveiled, I was told by people, pro-Trump people, well, this is very clever. We have to refinance all this debt, so let's drive down the stock market, and that'll lower yields, and we can refinance our debt at a lower rate. Of course, they did the Liberation Day tariffs, and what happened? Interest rates went up. Part of what's going on in Washington, I think, is amateur hour, and the thought that there's a cohesive, long-term strategy that's going to be followed through, I think that's just a dream. And so if I'm a foreign government, a foreign central bank, I have no more knowledge of what's going to happen in the U.S. than I think people in the U.S. Congress do, or people in the administration. It's very, very chaotic in terms of macroeconomic policy now in America.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to disagree with that. As I said, the Trump administration just rolled back the Chinese tariffs, and it's pretty hard to frame this as some sort of a four-dimensional chess game that's going on at this point. I think it's fair to say. Okay, well, I think we're all in agreement that something fundamentally is changing in America. Europe probably isn't prepared for it. They want to turn the monetary system into some sort of a policing system. It's a great idea.
Well, we are doing more of the same. If you look at the current commission, they're doing more of the same.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's clear. And they're about to roll out massive spending packages to reconstruct Ukraine and so on, which I don't think are affordable, but we'll see. But so in terms of alternatives, so I think it's a really interesting question. I'll briefly kind of give my own view of it, that I think a lot of discussion personally about the reserve currency is a little bit of a misunderstanding. You don't actually need a reserve currency like the US dollar as it currently is if you don't run massive trade imbalances, because you just don't need to accumulate enormous amounts of money. Gold standard systems and other systems like Bretton Woods keep the trade imbalances from getting too big, and so you only need a clearance system and a minor reserve currency. But in terms of, so what, I won't say what are the alternatives, although maybe we'll talk about that and some of the central bank stuff and the possibility of the euro or the yuan or something like that. But I suppose, like, I know it's an impossible question, but what are you kind of watching as the next developments in the evolution or progression of the global system? If Humpty Dumpty has fallen off a wall here, which I think there's some pretty good evidence that he has, and something fundamental is going to change, where do we go next? I mean, let's start with, do we default back to a gold standard?
I wish we could, but I doubt it.
I mean, only in an unofficial way, in that people will hold gold as a hedge, as a safe haven, but it's not, governments themselves won't agree to a gold standard and abide by a gold standard. Individuals trying to protect themselves will sort of have an unofficial gold standard, in the sense that they're just very leery of government currencies. They're very leery of the damage that governments are doing to stock and bond markets. They're very leery of what might happen in terms of global trade. It's a very uneasy time, and one thing we haven't even discussed is what happens if there's some sort of Greek-style crisis, not in Greece now. They've actually been pretty sensible in recent years, but Italy, enormous debts, no growth. What if there's a recession? Your GDP.
I bet on France first.
Could be France, or the U.S. is heading in the wrong direction rapidly. Once you throw in the mix a a major economy having a crisis where markets don't trust that they're going to repay their debts, then all bets are off. And then you're a former central banker. I mean, what on earth would a central banker do in a situation where there's a run on Italian debt, or pick your country?
Well, they will do exactly the same thing, because Frankfurt, and as I mentioned, is full of Keynesians, and they will simply follow the same pattern they did in 2008, they did in 2020, or actually 2021. Or what they did in 2000, and they will just follow the same thing. And they will not say, hey, guys, and this is why I mentioned it in my first remark, homework, structural reforms. This is something that our nation states, our countries need to do. And by structural reforms, pension reform that was already mentioned by Dan, but it's healthcare reform, social security, all that where we overspend, where our nation states overspend, whether it's the migration issues that we see. When Hungary luckily has it at bay, whereas Austria, for example, is a huge disaster on that front. The Germans, same thing. But no structural reforms have been done or undergone. And those countries who have done the first ones, like Greece, for example, they did something. Italy, to a certain extent as well, but not the real thing, not the full-fledged 180-degree change of gear. And so, therefore, I think the European Central Bank will simply continue to do so. And this is why they look at this alternative with the central bank digital currency, because then they can hide their failures, and they just simply devaluate the euro, just doing that with 1 0 or 1 in programming.
That's the Zimbabwe solution. I did see a comment the other day. I don't know who it was attributed to, but it was in relation to the Germans taking off the debt brake under Merz. And somebody commented that the fiscal rules, I think it was in Brussels, that the fiscal rules were actually only set up for bad countries like Italy and Spain, but the Germans could never do no wrong in that regard, forgetting the 1920s, I suppose. But
now that nobody behaves well in this case, the doors are open for flooding.
But I mean, what do you make from a political point of view that the Germans have thrown out the fiscal prudence? I mean, Germany was classically the anchor of fiscal prudence in the European Union and in the Eurozone afterwards. They had a debt brake in their constitution, and the CDU has torn up the debt brake. An already quasi-lame duck chancellor. I mean, what do you even make of this? What's going on in Germany?
It's a disaster. As I said, Europe is going down the drain. Unfortunately, we are dead, and we just don't know it yet. I mean, look at there is no growth. There's negative. There is no growth. I mean, it's negative in Germany, and they try to fix it with the Keynesian model. Just let government spend and think that you get consumption. No. People still, the saving accounts of the individuals across Europe are rising and rising because people don't spend, they don't trust, they are afraid of what is happening. And they want to have some safety back home. And I don't see this is good. And Merz, as you said, is not only a lame duck, he's a dead man walking.
If I can add on Germany, one of their problems is the Green New Deal policies. Their electricity costs per hour are 3 to 4 times higher than in the U.S., China, and so no surprise that Germany is deindustrializing. They've literally made their own industry anti-competitive with their green policies, and they're shutting down nuclear plants. I mean, just baffling to watch a country deliberately commit suicide like that. But then, of course, Merz, the recent election, he basically had a choice: either ally with the AfD or ally with the Social Democrats. An alliance with the Social Democrats meant you had to agree to spend a lot more money Now, whether that was a good idea or a bad idea, I have no idea on the politics of Germany, but they could have said, we're going to restrain domestic spending to finance a buildup of defense. We could have restrained the welfare state to finance more infrastructure. But no, they said, let's just spend more money everywhere. And their debt brake, by the way, has always been inferior to the Swiss debt brake, which should be the gold standard for Europe. The Swiss debt brake is actually a spending cap. In Switzerland, the burden of government spending is only 32% of GDP. In most other European countries, it's 50% of GDP. What are you getting in other countries that you're not getting in Switzerland? Switzerland, in general, has better schools, better roads, better health care, and they spend a lot less money per capita as a share of GDP. You have a role model. And by the way, you have a role model speaking at lunchtime with the Argentinian ambassador. We need Javier Milei in charge of the U.S. and Europe as well.
And the thing in Europe is bad politics. It's all, you look at Brussels, even the conservatives, and you mentioned Merz, but there are plenty of other conservatives from the so-called EPP, the European People's Party, and they are pursuing left-wing politics. Full stop. That's it. It's not center-right. They are not even center, they are left. And
by the way, the same problem in the U.S. where there are all these memes of showing Republicans saying, well, it's not socialism if we do it. And I don't know who said it, but someone had a great thing. There are now 2 left-wing parties in the U.S. The only difference is the pronouns they use.
But just I want to stay on Germany for a moment just to get at it. I mean, again, noting the irony, it's a CDU guy who used to work in banking that took off the debt brake and started splurging money, and I don't even know what to make of it. It's very strange. But you're a German speaker. I mean, what do you make of that? Like, where did it? So when I was during the Eurozone crisis, when I was studying economics, Germany were terrified of some sort of a return to Weimar hyperinflation and so on. It was like built into the German psyche. It had been there for a couple of generations at least, and it's just kind of evaporated. Like, it's not so much that, okay, you can find one not very popular politician to put up and, allow tomatoes to be thrown at him, which appears to be what Merz's job is. But you can do that, but why is there no opposition in the CDU? It's very strange.
Well, the opposition in the CDU would probably be the CSU from Bavaria, but they are obviously also too weak in that case. And once you have a former CSU politician, and now EPP politician, Mr. Weber, who openly announced, and he used war industry. We need war industry in Europe now. This was his term. Kriegswirtschaft. And if you remember the debates between Hayek and Keynes back then, it was exactly about this failed politics and failed central plan policies that are now pursued out of Brussels. And they just simply don't understand economics. And they are pursuing the wrong path. And this is Brussels, and this is why it eventually will either have to be totally reformed, or we might hit the wall and then Europe is dead, as we know it now, economically.
Okay, so I'll note 2 other things that have happened, a kind of a broad issue and something that's happened very recently. I saw a chart the other day that showed that since 2010, global South import demand is larger than American import demand. This explains a lot of the shift in the Chinese policy to importing to the global South and so on. Since Liberation Day, Asian currencies have skyrocketed. There was enormous moves in Taiwanese currency, in the South Korean currency, and in the poorer Asian countries, Indonesian and so on. Broadly speaking, what's your view of Asia in the emerging global system? I mean, America's at best kind of ambivalent about where it wants to go. Europe is getting a little bit of a short-term boost from moves in the dollar, but I strongly suspect that the structural issues will eventually drag it down. But Asia seems to be, quite hopeful in a sense. Markets are rallying there. the currencies are rallying and so on. So what's your broad view of Asia?
I briefly start because I know that Dan has a lot to say of that, and I have to apologize. I need to catch a train. We were talking about South Korea, Taiwan, picking up and being real exporters and producers, very productive states, getting their act together and having low taxes in comparison to what we do here. And I think those states are doing the right things. They're at least much better, and they are more competitive than Europe is. And they will outmaneuver us. So I'm positive about those Asian states.
I think you have to distinguish what you mean by Asia. There's China standing by itself, which has long-term major challenges because of demographics, and Xi is moving them back in a more state-controlled economy direction. So I am not optimistic about their economy, even though they have enormous reserves and enormous economic power right now. There are the super successful low-tax tiger economies like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. But what people aren't paying attention to is countries like Indonesia and Malaysia have been growing, they're getting a bigger share of the global economy. Vietnam, another place that a lot of manufacturing is shifting from China as a lot of Western nations want to decouple. So yes, there's a lot happening in Asia, but you really have, and by the way, India, I have long-run concerns about because their economy there's too much government corruption for them to ever become, I think, a manufacturing power, but I hope I'm wrong on that.
I'd be interested to know what you think of the fact that the Chinese, since Liberation Day, actually it's been going on for longer than that, it's been since the trade wars started really in 2016, carried on to the Biden administration. The Chinese have remade themselves as being advocates of global trade all over the world. That's what the Chinese say when they land in various global capitals. They say that we're now in favor of free trade and the United States is against free trade. So what do you make of that development?
Well, one of the risks of what Trump is doing is that China is going to have more power in terms of global trade. And you think all the way back to the Obama years when they were negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the whole purpose of that was to get everyone in the region other than China into a trading bloc because of concerns that China was using industrial policy and their capital markets to, in effect, subsidize their exports. And there's a lot of concern, but that's not free trade. That's cheating on the trade rules, and the WTO was too weak to really deal with it. But we pulled out of the TPP because that was when Trump was ascending, and even Hillary Clinton said, no, we're not going to do that. Biden never tried to reinstitute it. And then now we're in this strange situation where the Trump people are saying, we're doing all these tariffs because we want to isolate China. Well, that was the whole purpose of the TPP that Trump killed. That's why I said before, there's no rhyme or reason to U.S. strategy. It's basically Trump flying by the seat of his pants. And on some issues, you can say, he has good instincts in terms of fighting against wokeness. He has good instincts in terms of deregulating. He has good instincts in wanting to cut taxes. Trade is an area where, at least from an economic perspective, his instincts, I don't think, are very good.
Do you think there's any way from here to counter the fact that the Chinese have effectively become the champions of free trade in the world?
Well, I don't think they're really the champions of free trade as much as they're just taking advantage. And obviously, they have a huge incentive. If they think that the U.S. market is going to be cut off for them, or at least severely restricted, they obviously want to make up by selling more to other countries. And they will use export subsidies. They will use... remember the Belt and Road Initiative? That was a big issue a few years ago. That's all about buying friends and, in effect, trying to bring countries into the Chinese orbit. And I'm not saying this negatively. I mean, they're looking out for their own self-interest. I just wish they looked out for their own self-interest in a genuine free market way, not in a state-directed sort of industrial policy way. Because that's where I think if they had evolved like Singapore evolved, I think people, and that's what people in the U.S. thought. When we gave China most favored nation status, there was a lot of optimism 15 years ago that China was going to become a prosperous, Western-oriented capitalist nation. And as I already said, Xi is moving them in the wrong direction. And I think that explains a lot of the hostility among both Republicans and Democrats. A huge change in Washington in just the last 10 to 15 years is that everyone now sees China as not being a friend, whereas it used to be we thought that was going to be a great development.
And I just want to get your perspective on this clear. So, if the Chinese are engaged in export subsidization or anything like that, I don't know to what extent they are or not. It's very hard to tell, but I'm sure they are subsidizing some stuff. Do you think then? I mean, some people who are pushing the tariffs and the trade sanctions and so on are saying that merits the tariffs. I mean, does it or?
Well, this is one of the reasons why it's very frustrating working on trade in Washington, because one day I'm talking to people who are in the White House or close to the White House, and they're saying, oh, Dan, stop worrying, because this is all a very clever strategy to isolate China. Well, I already mentioned, we had the TPP. That was the purpose of that. And then, okay, well, if you want to isolate China, why are you... The first thing you did was 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And then the second thing you did was steel and aluminum tariffs. What does that have to do with China, other than, maybe they have some of the steel and aluminum? So I'm baffled, and I think all of Washington is baffled. What is the administration actually trying to do? And you know what the answer probably is? It depends on whether Peter Navarro has the president's ear. It depends whether Lighthizer has the president's ear. It depends whether Lutnick has the president's ear. So I don't think there's a cohesive, well thought out strategy. And what we're seeing playing out in front of our eyes every day is just different political factions. And Trump, again, seat of the pants. He wakes up, he sees something on Fox News, and that probably determines what executive order he signs that day. And again, on some issues, I love Trump's instincts. On trade, not so much.
Well, I think devil's advocate is that I have noticed that a lot of free market think tanks in DC are effectively defending some sort of free market autarky in the US. They seem to be supporting what they seem to think of as strategic tariffs. If it's in national security interest, I don't really know how to define that. And then, there's been multiple books written that basically you just have to, it's fine to do the tariffs and so on as long as you have low taxes at home. What's your view on? To me, it seems that there's miscommunication even on that side of the fence in DC right now.
I don't have a good answer. When the Commerce Secretary Lutnick goes on TV and says, "Oh, this is really part of a plan to go back to the 1800s and have tariffs finance the government instead of the income tax," well, that tickles my funny bone. I like that idea, except there's one trivial little detail. We had a central government that only consumed 2% of GDP in the 1800s. Now we have a central government that consumes 23% of GDP. It would literally take tariffs of 220% to replace taxes on income in America. Well, guess what? If you have tariffs of 220%, how much revenue do you collect from tariffs? Nothing, because you're obviously way, way, way past the Laffer curve revenue maximizing tariff rate, because no one's going to pay a 220% premium for Chinese steel or German cars or something like that. So there's no way with the big government we have now, and of course it's not that big compared to Europe, but it's still far bigger than we used to have. So again, I just come back to what I keep saying. There's no way to analyze Trump trade policy because there's more than one policy and it changes from day to day. Now, that doesn't mean the arguments, like I used to work at the Heritage Foundation, they've been somewhat sympathetic. They're making some arguments that are very reasonable. Well, you don't trade, national security goods. You don't want to be dependent on Taiwan for your semiconductors when China might take them over. And what about our defense industrial base? There are all sorts of good reasons to think that we don't have pure free trade in the world, and the U.S. should have some sort of strategic response. But the response we're getting is more chaotic than it is strategic, I think.
So we started a bit late. We're officially coming up on time, but how about I open it up to the floor for questions? If there is questions, there is questions, so we'll finish a little bit later.
Okay, my name is Lee Schooland. Not only I'm made in China, And also, I go to China very often. I was there 3 weeks ago. And then I think when we go to China in July, you might see China from a slightly different perspective, because I was very surprised what's going on in China right now, facing Trump. And actually, Barbara was saying, in the U.S., in Europe, the economists are Keynesian, but in China, the top economists, majority of them are Austrian. I'm not joking. They're majority of them are Austrian. And they know what they're doing. But on the other hand, they're a communist country. So they have to protect their faith and the communist ideology, which they don't believe. And so China is not going to be hurt very much. They know they have their ways. And earlier, Philip, you said the four sides chess game. China is not one of the four sides. They're playing their own Chinese chess game. They're not going to be participating in the four-side chess game. They're really doing their best playing their own chess game, and they are doing something that a lot of people don't talk about. Like they opened up visa-free for a lot of countries, one-sided, and also zero tariff, 14 countries, one-sided, before Trump. So they're doing things, and I think I hate communism. I hate it really passionately, but then I look at what they're doing economically. I have to say they're not doing a bad job.
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that the Trump administration backed down from the tariffs, not China. So, I mean, that's just the reality of what happened.
I don't think Trump really understands China. He doesn't.
I have a question for, especially for Dr. Dan Mitchell. If you could go back, because you're pretty clear about how your feelings of what Trump has not done very well so far on trade. This is a trade question. If you could go back, put the genie back in the bottle on to January 20th, what would you have recommended for Trump to do, number one? Number two is, now that the genie's out of the bottle, can it be fixed?
If it was January 20th, 2025, and for some reason he was asking me my advice, I would have said quietly encourage decoupling from China. Maybe sort of ratchet up tariffs slowly so you're not disrupting the American economy and suddenly the risk of their shortages of toys at Christmas. Things like that matter a lot politically. And of course, most important thing of all is I would always want to have some sort of back channel communication saying, look, we want you to become a prosperous, free market oriented economy. I hope Lee is right. Lee and I teach every year in July in China, and we do everything we can to try to encourage economic reform there. Now, okay, so that's what January 20th, 2025. What about today? The fundamental problem is Trump thinks a trade deficit means you're losing. A trade deficit is a good surplus. A trade deficit, the flip side of that, is an investment surplus. If foreigners sell something to Americans and they get dollars, some of them decide, I want to invest in the U.S. economy. That's not a bad thing. It's good to be a capital surplus economy. And Trump genuinely thinks a trade deficit means money is just leaving your economy and never coming back. So part of the solution is education. I don't think that's going to really take. So then I think, realistically speaking, the best thing to convince them of is, lower tariffs with the rest of the world, and then try to, as I already said, cajole China into becoming a more market-oriented economy, if that's possible. And I'll defer to Lee on her greater intrinsic knowledge of China. I have a hard time answering the question because the administration am I talking to Trump? Am I talking to Navarro? Am I talking to Lutnick? Am I talking to Lighthizer? It's a mess.
Okay, well, we're up on time now, so we can maybe take, 5-minute break? 5-minute break, and then come back for the next panel. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to our speakers, both present and dearly departed.
So the second panel today is going to be very much so related to the first panel. The first panel was obviously on the dollar and gold, which is inherently tied up with trade issues, because the monetary system, in a sense, is born out of or shapes the global trade system. So in the second panel, we'll more explicitly address tariffs and trade, but I'm sure we'll be coming up against the same topics, some of the same topics as we did in the first. So for the second panel, I'd like to introduce I'm going to butcher the name, Professor Zsarnoczky, the Professor of Politics at the University of Iceland, and Dr. Eamon Butler, founder and director of the Adam Smith Institute in London.
So, thank you both for being here, and thank you everyone for sticking around, or if you've just joined us, thank you for coming. Perhaps we'll start with the elephant in the room, which is President Trump's Liberation Day policy. If either of you would like to give me your general impressions on Liberation Day, and then we perhaps can move to more specific issues. Dr. Butler, perhaps you'd like to go first.
Well, of course, it was a very extreme event. At the same time, I think that it does gel very prominently with a lot of feeling in the United States that trade is unfair and that American jobs are being lost. So there is that. But massive tariffs throughout the world, very large scale, very large speed, a lot of economic disruption I think we can expect out of it. There's talk of global trade wars and all of that kind of thing. And I think it's a very capricious sort of thing. But at the same time, I think the Americans think, well, we'll get some revenue out of this. It's a country that was built on tariffs, actually, in its early days. So that's very deep in the American consciousness, I think. And as I say, it does have voter support. In terms of its effect on global trade, I don't think it's going to set back global trade. I mean, my country, the United Kingdom, has just the other day signed a trade deal with the United States, which we've been talking about for a long time. So that's the first trade deal in the Trump administration, the world's biggest economy. And we've already signed trade deals with India and Japan and many of the Pacific countries. So global trade continues. It may be slightly diverted. I think that it's possible that this American stance, in as much as it continues, and we don't know, Trump is a very fickle sort of person, but this stance might make countries like Europe look to other sources of supply and to other markets. It might make China look more to the ASEAN countries and so on. It's a big world out there, and I think there are plenty of countries that you can trade with, even if the United States is imposing taxes on its own citizens, effectively, through tariffs.
Professor Gershon?
Yes, I first want to express my appreciation of being here in Hungary. It's one of my favorite countries. I enjoy all my visits here. I am a member of the Montpellier Society, and one of the people I got to know here was Otto von Habsburg, who would have been the king of Hungary if the Austrian Empire had not collapsed. And one thing which was extraordinary about him was he never spoke of anything except Hungary. He was obviously thinking about Hungary all the time, and Hungary was uppermost in his mind. He read and spoke Hungarian. That was very intriguing. When I was a young man, I sometimes campaigned against communism in schools. And then I used to end my speeches by a poem by Petöfi, the Hungarian national poet. Upp nú líður landið verðu, loks tvíkost boðin sérðu, þjóðar frelsi, þrældómshelsi, þú sérð munin, kjóstu frelsi. And every Hungarian that I have quoted this with knows which lines these are, stanzas in the national anthem of Hungary. So I have Hungarian roots, but let me move on to the question. I don't think this is a liberation day. I think it is an enslavement day, because free trade is crucial for us for two reasons. One is prosperity, and the other one is peace. Prosperity because, as David Hume, who was an atheist and a skeptic, said in one of his essays, he said, God meant us to trade because it divided the goods of the earth so differently that we have to trade in order to better our conditions, which is coming from Hume, the skeptic. If Poland has corn and Portugal has wine, then we both gain from trading corn and wine. Everybody knows this, and this was put into a system by Adam Smith and David Ricardo and all those eminent economists. And this is something which is simply, in my opinion, true, that the road to prosperity is through division of labor and free trade. But there is another thing which is extremely important about free trade, and it is peace. If you see in your neighbor a potential customer, your propensity to shoot at him diminishes. You all gain from each other, and this is the reason why mercantilism and tariffs, they increase the likelihood of war. One good example of this was Japan in the 1930s. America and other countries, they were squeezing in Japan. Japan couldn't sell their goods anywhere. And what did they do? They attacked other nations. Where goods are not allowed to cross borders, soldiers will. This is what we have learned the hard way. So I believe this was something that I do not applaud. I really regret it. Donald Trump has done many good things. I am not his opponent. I support a lot of it, but I disagree strongly with him on tariffs and on Russia.
So, Dr. Butler, you said you weren't as concerned about the tariff system. Do you think that the Trump administration is going to default back to a free trade position? I mean, in some sense, the trade war has been going on since 2016. Joe Biden did carry on many of the aspects of the trade war, sanctions and so on China intensified during that. And of course, we got discussions in Europe and in Britain as well of decoupling and de-risking and all these things. And these words still seem to bounce around, certainly in London and certainly in DC. So do you expect that perhaps because Liberation Day didn't go so well and that the Americans have pulled back now, as of yesterday, that we're returning to a kind of 1990s era of free trade ideology in London and Washington, or something more modest than that?
Well, if I could predict the Trump administration, I would be a very rich person. But I can't, and I'm not. It's very difficult to know what is going to happen. And it seems to, I think as Dan Mitchell was saying in the morning, it seems to depend on what the president read in the newspaper in the morning. And that sets the tone for the whole administration and for many people who are ardent Trump supporters that will flip from one point of view on Ukraine, for example, to another. So it is, I think, a very difficult time. I mean, there are some people who say that, well, the Liberation Day, it was just a bargaining chip, that Trump is a real estate agent, he likes deals, and so he leads in with a tough a tough demand at the beginning, and then that's gradually eroded. And in the case of the UK, that's certainly happened. But I actually think he believes all this stuff. He really does believe that tariffs are a good thing for the American economy, and that it will raise revenue and that it will preserve jobs in the middle of America, which, of course, feels itself very underrepresented by Washington and the East Coast elites. So I think it's very difficult to know exactly what the thinking is, or indeed if there is any thinking behind it. And in terms of where it's going to go, I think, again, as I keep saying, it's a big world, and there are plenty of other places that you can trade with, and I think that that's really what's going to happen. But, I mean, it's interesting, in the first Trump administration, there's really no doubt. I think every economist agreed that the steel tariffs, for example, hurt the American manufacturing industry. And yet, Trump seems to think that, well, that's just fine. You know, we can carry on and do more of it. So, who knows?
And Professor Zsarnoczky, what sort of damage do you envisage that the tariffs, if they're carried through, okay, they've been put on hold now. I don't think there's much point in speculating, you know, where they're going to go in the next 3 weeks. I think that's as fruitless as trading markets right now, frankly. Everything's on Trump's Truth Social account. Everything's tied to it right now. So there's not much point in doing that. But assuming that this is some sort of a move away from free trade, what kind of damage do you expect that to do to the United States in particular, or Europe for that matter?
Well, the difference between the United States and, say, Europe is that the United States is a very, very large free trade area. And the United States could progress and encourage economic growth in the 19th century despite of tariffs. However, if we have tariffs, we are foregoing the gains from trade because we are prohibited from buying goods where they are cheapest. And thus we are not only losing, but we are also losing connection with those countries and friendship with those countries. So we will lose both prosperity and peace by tariffs. That would really be my answer to that question.
I don't think this is the end of free trade in the world, though. I mean, trade is astonishingly resilient. I mean, we've been trading for about 20,000 years, as far as I can make out. And you know, look at prehistory, and you can see that trading was going on even then. It's very resilient, and yes, of course, there are blockages along the way, but at the same time, firms are very good at, businesses are very good at diversifying and finding new markets and finding new suppliers. And since globalization, opening up of India and Eastern Europe and so on, that there are many more people now who are part of the World Trading Network and all of the Pacific Rim now. So I think what might happen is that you might end up with a certain growth in blocks, of trading blocks around the world, the EU and South America and Mercosur and the ASEAN countries and so on. So that might be a result of this, that people looking more to their own backyard rather than more globally to the United States and China and places. But at the same time, I think the trading system is adaptable, and I don't think we should worry about it too much. You know, we'll come back in 10 years' time, and we'll have forgotten any of this ever happened.
I think Elon Musk's idea that we should construct a free trade area and abolish all tariffs in North America and Europe is a fascinating one. And I think that the right response of the European Union when Trump imposed tariffs on the European Union would have been just to abolish all tariffs and see what he would do then. There is something wrong with tariffs, in my opinion. And what we ought to do is to create wealth and we create wealth if we obey the God that I referred to earlier, who had distributed the goods of the world in such a different way that we have to trade.
Yeah, I thought after Brexit that we should just say to the world, right, anybody that wants to trade with the UK, no tariffs at all, we should do it. And of course, there's enormous resistance to that because people say, oh, no, you need a bargaining chip to make people. But no, a tariff is a tax on your own people. Import controls are a restriction on your own people, and they cost your economy, so don't do it.
Well, I'd love to get your perspective, Dr. Butler, on the debate in Britain right now around trade, especially with China. I mean, the American-British relationship may have already been determined. We'll see. The terms, I don't think, have clearly been laid out yet, but there's at least a preliminary to a deal, and ultimately that will be an arrangement between the United States and Britain, and I don't think there's anything impeding that. But I think the big question in London right now is trade with China, because America seemed quite hostile to the notion. Theresa May's government famously got the Chinese out of a nuclear power plant and so on. Prior to that, Cameron's government tried to set up a renminbi trading sector in the City of London. That was also shelved. How do you view that question from your perch in London at the moment?
Well, I think it's possible that, I think our trade deal with the United States is probably just the first phase in a larger trade deal. At least I certainly hope it is. And clearly as part of that, the Trump administration wants the UK to be less cozy with China, naturally. And I'm sure that they will try to impose conditions on other countries. The UK is, by tradition, a broad trading nation, and therefore it's not surprising that we trade with China. But I think certainly since the COVID experience, where China was basically a monopoly supplier of personal protective equipment, that people have become very much more skeptical about China in the UK. And people have actually diversified their supply lines rather more. So I'm fairly sanguine on that issue. I mean, as Dan was saying, a few years ago we hoped that China was a new capitalist nation and would be a liberal part of the world trading system, and that hasn't happened. You've got something that is directed from the center. So I think that we're all aware of that, and I think we are skeptical about it. But then equally, people buy from the cheapest supplier. So people still buy from China, even though they know that this is a slightly risky operation.
Professor Guschertson, what do you make of the European approach to the same question? Obviously, during the Biden administration, there was a strong push to impose protectionist measures on Chinese goods, most notably their electronic vehicles. And during that time, the European leaders seemed very inclined to go along with this, whereas since Trump has got in, it's become, I think, an open question in Brussels. I'd like to know your perspective on the European approach to protectionism against Chinese products.
I think that Trump is absolutely right that Europe has to pay for her own defenses, and that Europe should abolish the tariffs on American goods. And they should really trade and be in a defense alliance as equals. And Europe has the capacity both to defend herself and also to be not a closed state, but an open market, a federation of states and not a federal state. Unfortunately, since 1992, the European Union has changed character. From 1957 to 1992, the European Union was about economic integration, about an internal market, constructing an internal market. After 1992, it became an exercise in creating a superpower. I believe that the best way of forward for the European Union would be actually the Nordic model. I'm writing a book about it, about the roots of liberty in the Nordic states. And the Nordic model is freedom of secession, like Norway from Denmark in 19
It's in demand, you say.
Yes, right. Freedom from secession and border changes by plebiscites, like in Denmark, and cooperation between countries with a minimal what we can call removal of sovereignty. This is the Nordic cooperation. And I think it's much better than try to ape the American one. So my answer would be, I would like to see free trade between a strong Europe, able to defend herself, and a strong North America, able to defend itself, and welcoming everybody else, like South America, and Northern Africa, and so on. That would be my hope.
With protectionism on China, is that correct?
China is a different case. China doesn't play fair. I am all for the 300 million people who have worked themselves out of poverty in China into the middle class, and I would very much like to give them opportunity, because the way to tackle poverty in the world is not at all to subsidize it by development aid or anything like that, but rather by free trade. But they are, at the moment, in my opinion, a threat and should be excluded from the free trade paradigm.
Just one thing on the European Union. I mean, if you're, I can say this as being no longer a part, but if you are exporting less to the United States, that's not good for incomes in the European Union. And it's particularly bad for countries like Germany, which has been mentioned already, and Italy, which are big exporters to the United States. So I think it's quite possible that these tariffs might raise tensions within the European Union, and different countries will find that they have different interests. And I think that's something that you guys will have to manage.
Interesting. I suppose the other thing to talk about is, when you're talking about trade and tariffs and so on, is I suppose the other side of the coin. The response by China to the increasing closure of the Western markets to China has been to try and expand into the global south, in effect. So if you look at Chinese exports, where they're going, there are still lots of exports going to Europe and the United States, there's no doubt about that, but the growth rates in the global south are much, much higher, and it's becoming increasingly typical to see Chinese electronic vehicles, Chinese products and so on in global south countries. So what do you make of the other side of this coin? So if we have a kind of a Cold War trading structure, in a sense, a neo-Cold War trading structure, but the Chinese continue to trade with the fastest growing part of the world, how do you see, what does that mean, I suppose, for the West?
Well, of course, the effect on China of Trump's tariffs would be a major hit to incomes, to exports, but to incomes. So I think you're looking at slowing in China of GDP growth. The IMF is certainly predicting that. And I think that you can fairly easily predict that more trade in China will switch to the ASEAN nations, the Asian nations. And of course, they have responded already in terms of a sort of made in China initiative, trying to get people to, just like the Americans, trying to get people to buy domestic goods. And of course, expanding their links with the BRICS, these countries. So I think those were going to be the Chinese response, and I think Lee will know better than I, but the Chinese do think rather long term. 1,000 years is just a fleeting moment in the Chinese mind. And so I think they're probably thinking, yeah, let's just ride this out, and we can go to other places. And as was discussed earlier in the morning, there are plenty of places where China is putting vast amounts of capital and trying to buy friends all over the world, including in Europe. So I think that will be the strategy, and to move into other things. Like, I mean, in the UK we have a vast Chinese investments in education, much to my concern, because I think that it's very bad for free speech on campus. What's happening, that you can't criticize the Chinese government because they're paying for new buildings and professorships and all that kind of thing. So I think China's very subtle. They'll be moving to those sorts of things which are not as visible as cars exporting across the planet.
Professor, what do you make of the other side of the coin there, that if the exports aren't coming to, the Chinese exports aren't coming to the West, the markets are being found in these rapidly developing ASEAN nations, Global South, Latin America, and so on?
Well, I think that there are great opportunities now in Northern Africa, especially in Morocco and Egypt, and in Brazil, to replace China as the great supplier of goods. I wanted to contrast perhaps Trump with Reagan. There was a biographer and a writer of Reagan, Evans, I believe was his name, and he was once having dinner with the Reagans when Reagan was governor of California. And he was waiting for the drinks in the library. And he couldn't resist looking at the books Reagan was reading. And he took out a book, and it was a book by Bastiat, the most eloquent and effective spokesman of free trade in the 19th century, who had a great impact on a lot of people. And the book had already, obviously been read. There was a lot of underlining and comments and so on. And he said to himself, here we have a future president of the United States, a thoughtful man who is reading and is in support of free trade, which is fundamental to prosperity. And unfortunately, Trump is not like that. He has many good qualities, but he is not like Reagan, a free trader.
I'd like to raise an issue that has only provisionally come up with the talk around Liberation Day and so on. It is speculative, but it's being discussed in the Trump administration. This is the issue of so-called secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs. So what's broadly been happening, it's quite well known in DC now, Harvard Business School have published a study recently that in response to some of the trade restrictions put in place in the first Trump administration, but especially in the Biden administration, there is basically the trade is being rerouted through other countries. So the parts, as it were, for a Chinese product will be shipped to Mexico or to Vietnam. They'll be reconstructed and branded with a Made in Vietnam stamp on the bottom of it, or Made in Mexico stamp. You can see this in the trade statistics. It's extremely obvious. It's being widely discussed in DC. I think people are becoming quite aware of it too, so I think it'll become a live issue. So that kind of speaks to the previous question, but it's a knock-on effect for us. Dr. Butler, how would you see that? Do you think that that is an issue that can be dealt with? I mean, the only way you can really do that is impose secondary sanctions on or secondary tariffs on another country. And of course, that's when a trade war starts to spiral and perhaps even get out of control. So I'd love to know your thoughts on the issue of secondary tariffs.
Well, of course, Hannes's iPhone is made in 63 different countries, I think, contribute to it. So it's very difficult with modern technology and modern supply chains to say, where does a product come from? You buy a car, and little bits of it might come from Hungary, and little bits of it might come from Ireland, and little bits of it might come from Spain, and, who knows? And so, is that a Spanish good? Is it an Irish good? Is it, you can't do it. So that to me reveals what you've said reveals the lack of understanding and theory in the Trump administration about the nature of trade. It is we are interdependent now in a very big way. I mean, we feel this with the film industry. Trump has said, okay, we're going to put tariffs on all foreign films. Well, things like the Bond films are made in the UK for the most part, but they're also made on location in lots of other countries. And that's how films are made. And American films are made in America, you think. Well, no, they're not. They may be shot in America. They may be shot in locations around the planet, but they'll be finished in London, probably. So, is that an American film or is it a British film? So I don't think there's any way of managing this. And that's what makes the whole thing senseless even to talk about it.
There is a lot of hypocrisy in foreign relations. Take, for example, the response of the European countries after the first attack on Ukraine in 2014. The European superpowers, they forced everybody in Europe to impose sanctions against Russia. Iceland, my own country, had sold fish to Russia, and it cost us a lot to have to cease to do so. At the same time, the Germans continued to buy oil and gas from Russia, a totally different thing. I'm personally very much against the sanctions, and I fear, I'm actually an optimist, not a pessimist, that we may be approaching something like 1914. Because we have to realize that free trade had only prevailed in the world in the 1860s to about 1880s. Bismarck, he turned his back on free trade. Others did. It was really only Denmark and the United Kingdom that implemented free trade by 1914 is little known. And then we had this war, and as Neil Ferguson argued very well, the United Kingdom started to participate in the war, which meant that Austria-Hungary and Germany lost the war, and if they had not, Austria-Hungary and Germany would have won the war against Serbia and Russia and France, and we would have had, in about 10 years after the war, a loose federation of European states dominated by Germany, just as we have now, but we have sacrificed 20 to 30 million people. That is the difference. Same outcome, but great sacrifice.
I'll ask one final question, then we'll turn it to the floor to see if there's any other questions. Obviously, I think it's been a theme of this up until now that what you might call a securitization discourse has crept into discussions about trade de-risking, decoupling, whether you should have your masks and so on made in China and everything like that. Do you see any risk to that? Do you think that's manageable, or do you see that it's a bit like how do you? I mean, I think of it as how do you actually classify something as a national security risk? In a sense, making steel as a national security risk because you can build guns with it. But we probably aren't going to say, okay, well that's the same as importing Russian missiles to put on British ships or something like that. So do you think that there's a clear way of managing that, or do you see some risk for free trade proponents in the securitization narrative?
Well, just on steel, I mean, my government is putting large subsidies into keeping a steel mill open in the UK, which was owned by China, and the Chinese owners were going to close it down. And quite right, too, because it's completely useless. But we feel that we have to subsidize it because if we're going to have trade wars with everybody, then we need the strategic material of steel. So what is this, as you say, what is this strategic material and what isn't? It's very difficult to know. I mean, I think there are certain things like we have rules on Chinese companies being involved in our telecommunications network, for example, because we think we're being spied on. And so a government can do that kind of thing. But in terms of other things, I don't think it's a wise policy to try to insulate yourself and make yourself completely self-dependent. As Adam Smith put it 250 years ago, that a wise family buys from the cheapest source. They don't try to do everything themselves and make everything that they need, their furniture and their food and all the rest of it. So what we need to do, of course, is to open up new sources of supply. And I think that this happens quite naturally in the private market. And I think that this is really what is happening. As I say, it's a big world, and there are plenty of other people that you can trade with.
Professor, do you see any risks to the securitization narrative? Do you think it's manageable to have government decide what is and isn't a strategic good or input?
Well, it is quite difficult, but you have to realize that they come from a tiny nation, Iceland, with less than 1 million people, and the only thing that we export more or less is fish. I have said when I'm asked about our numbers that we go for quality, not quantity. In my country, so we are not military experts in any way. We don't have an army.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll open it up to questions now. We're in the last 10 minutes, so if anybody has a question, please put your hand up.
Hello. I'll try and phrase a question. I'm very confused about everything. I normally live in Malawi in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm kind of asking myself, how does free trade help a country like Malawi, which is landlocked only with natural resources and without much infrastructure? So is free trade something which can help a country like Malawi, or do we need regulations to help a country like Malawi become competitive?
Well, actually, if you look at the countries in Africa, they have prohibited free trade in elephants and rhinos, which would be the best thing for them to do. They are trying to impose some kind of a moratorium on using those endangered species, but if they would create owners who would look after the rhinos and the elephants and will sell the ivory and the horns of the rhinos, they would look after them. So the best way to preserve interesting species in Africa, in my opinion, like rhinos and elephants, would be to establish property rights to them and allow free trade in their products, which are much in demand in the world.
Dr. Butler?
Well, I just say that if you look at somewhere like, let's say, Hong Kong 100 years ago, it was a complete backwater. There's nothing going on there at all. And yet it became one of the financial powerhouse of that part of the world, and indeed more internationally. So I think that there are all sorts of things that you can do, provided that, as Hannah says, you get out of the way and allow people to do that. There's a story of Alexander the Great, who visited the great philosopher Diogenes, the Cynic philosopher, who rejected all worldly wealth and lived in a barrel, a wine butt. And Alexander said, "Great Diogenes, what can I, Alexander, with all my wealth and armies, what can I do to help you?" And Diogenes said, "Stand out of the sunlight." And I think that's what governments have got to do, stand out of the sunlight and let things grow.
Any more questions before we go for a break? There's one there. Last question.
Question to the professor. Let's say the world gets this Nordic model, as you talked about, which has a hint of individualism in it. Why would it be bad to include China?
Well, China would have to behave and implement fair trade and cease to threaten their neighbors. They took Tibet. It wasn't theirs by any right. They are now threatening to take Taiwan. They are extremely aggressive in the South China Sea. They dump their products on the international market. They undervalue their currency. They engage in all kinds of practices that we should deplore. If China would change, I would be the first person to welcome China into the free world, definitely. I'm nothing against China. I'm an admirer of Chinese culture. It is in many ways superior to ours. They began much earlier, and Lao Tse was basically the first libertarian. You couldn't accuse me of being anti-Chinese. They just have to play by the rules like the rest of us.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our two speakers. I think we have a few minutes to go to the bathroom or anything before 10. No, we do not. So everyone has to stay put. You are banned from leaving. Thank you so much to our two speakers, and thank you.
So now I'm very pleased to welcome to the podium the ambassador of the Argentine Republic, as well as ambassador to Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Hungary. She has a busy portfolio. Ambassador Maria Lorena Capra. She holds a degree in political science from the University of Buenos Aires and a master's in international affairs in strategic studies from King's College London. She joined the Argentine Foreign Service in 2005 and specialized in nuclear cooperation and non-proliferation issues. In 2021, she was appointed director of the Directorate of International Security, Nuclear and Special Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where she was responsible for overseeing matters related to multilateral and bilateral cooperation regarding nuclear and space affairs, defense, disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. She also represented Argentina to the Brazilian-Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Materials. Before, she served with the Permanent Mission of Argentina to the Organization of American States, where she worked on hemispheric security matters such as the fight against terrorism, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and the illegal trade of firearms, among others. She'll be discussing the economic miracle that's taken place in Argentina under President Milei. Welcome, Ambassador Capra.
Well, good morning. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, the Danube Institute, to invite the embassy to participate in this forum and this event, and have the opportunity to talk of our current situation of economy. As Melissa mentioned, it's not my comfort zone, so I will try to do my best and try to explain the situation, the current situation around economy and the impact in other aspects. So thank you again. As I mentioned, it's an honor to participate today in this event that is meant for academics and experts who will present and debate the ideas of such influential economists as Friedrich von Hayek. It's pretty clear that we can find today more than ever a special connection between Hayek's ideas and Argentina, given that President Milei has implemented since December 2023 the ideas of freedom that allow my country to begin a journey of economic growth and disinflation based on sensible economic policies of freedom and build on favorable conditions for economic agents. In June 2024, do you remember maybe President Milei receiving in Hamburg the medal of the Friedrich von Hayek Foundation, an award granted for promoting the ideas of economic liberalism and its concrete application in Argentine economic policies. So the Argentine government began at the end of 2023 an ambitious program of economic reforms aimed at boosting free market conditions, deregulation, and reducing fiscal deficit. The economic policy measures applied in Argentina have made visible progress in controlling a high inflation produced by an excessive monetary emission. Inflation can be considered an excess of money supply, a monetary phenomenon. Once monetary supply is controlled, inflation can be significantly reduced. The projected figures concerning growth and macroeconomic stability for the next few years are promising, as can we see in the forecast of international economics organisms. Let's talk about the pillars. Argentine's current economic policies are supported by 4 fundamental pillars. Deregulation, first. Second, boosting private investment and as the main driving engine. Third, free market policies encouraging competition with minimum state intervention. And fourth, innovation as the key to sustainable growth. The inherent regulation of the Argentine economy are being significantly dismantled. Being the most recent, the free purchase of foreign currency, the so-called cepo, was eliminated, correcting the real cost of the inflationary problem, which was the fiscal deficit financed by monetary emission, allowed the Argentine economy to enter a path of persistent reduction of inflation indicators. The deregulation of foreign trade was achieved by facilitating imports and eliminating previous restrictions, which boost international trade decisively. Argentine's international trade experienced a notable recovery in 2024 and 2025. In this sense, free trade and free markets are fundamental postulates that lead to more efficient allocation of resources and producing welfare, avoiding the distortions introduced by subsidies and tariff barriers, which President Milei's government intends to continue dismantling. Achieve of economic goals. As a result of the implemented measure, economy react with economic growth and improvement in macroeconomic indicators. First, zero fiscal deficit. In 2024, the economy achieved a financial surplus of 0.3% of GDP, the first since 2010, by cutting public spending by 30% and eliminating subsidies. Second, sharp drop in the inflation rate, as I mentioned before, from 25.5% in December 2023 to 2.2% in January 2024, only 1 month after. And now the indicators are very, very promising. Country risk rating, JP Morgan indicator, reduced from 3,000 to less than 7 points yesterday, reflecting greater confidence in the market. Stable monetary policy and deregulation of key sectors. Argentina is expected to be one of the fastest growing economies in 2025. According to the World Bank, 5% in 2025 and 4.7% in next year, versus an average growth of 2.5% in 2025 and 6.6% for the next year for Latin America. So Argentina's GDP in 2024 was $633,267 million, according to the World Bank. GDP per capita in 2024 was $12,800, according to the IMF. Wages have recovered in real terms, and poverty is being reduced in relation to 2023 figures. The recent agreement between Argentina and the IMF, signed in April 2025, just a month ago, established a loan of $20 billion under a 48-month extended fund facility program. The main objective of this agreement are to stabilize the economy, strengthen international reserves, and advance in structural reforms. The central bank's growth international reserves increased from 23,070 million in 2023 to 29,612 million in 2024, and the signing of the agreement strengthened Argentina's reserve position. The confidence shock that the economy program has produced in individuals has determined the foreign currency outside the banking system has entered it, adding an extra supply of money, boosting economic growth. So tax reduction and the role of the private sector. If the economy continues to grow as it's doing, the government has a plan to reduce taxes by approximately 1.5 points of GDP per year, which is equivalent to returning $420 billion to the private sector over the next 6.5 years. Regarding agreements, international and trade agreements. So Argentina seeks to strengthen trade agreements such as the Mercosur-EU Treaty and has expressed interest in a free trade agreement with the United States, although without abandoning the Mercosur. The EU-Mercosur agreement, it's a global landscape leading towards increasing geo-economic fragmentation, where trade and alliances can no longer be taken for granted. So in this context, economy blocs must strengthen their cooperation to ensure stability and resilience to external shocks. For almost 3 decades, Mercosur and the EU have been negotiating to conclude a bi-regional agreement. This bi-regional agreement is one of the largest in history, integrating more than 700 million people and 31 countries. Its scale generates mutual gains and improves consumer welfare in both regions. Through competition, the agreement acts as a catalyst for innovation and shared economy development. It also lays the groundwork for the elimination of protectionist barriers, promoting a more open and dynamic trade environment. So another measure that took the government is the name is Incentive Regime for Large Investment, the letters RIGI. Argentina's economic growth will be driven by private investment, as I mentioned, and innovation, and the real engine of economic growth. The RIGI is an initiative which seeks to attract foreign and domestic investment through tax, custom, and currency exchange benefits. It encourages large investments in strategic sectors like mining, energy, infrastructure, agribusiness, and others to boost the economy and increase exports. Projects submitted in 2024 and 2025 more than 10 with investment that amount to more than $12 billion, mainly in mining, in lithium and gold, and energy. This regime will allow many projects in the mining and hydrocarbon sector to be put into production, which will have a positive impact on exports and consequently on the trade balance sheet. So a big interest in RIGI is already reflected in projects submitted by a total of over 1,000 companies, covering sectors such as renewable energies, lithium mining, and iron and steel. New investments are expected in e-fuel, LNG, lithium and electric infrastructure, consolidating Argentina as a key player in global supply chains. In addition, artificial intelligence is beginning to position itself as a strategic sector. Argentina is not only open for business, but is leading its transformation to become a preferred destination for long-term strategic investments. Our tradition as a supplier of agricultural products, we are currently going through a new chapter to stimulate productive growth in new and different areas. Lithium and copper, strategic resources for the energy transition. Argentina is one of the world's leading suppliers of lithium, the fourth, and the world's third largest reserve. It has five copper projects at an advanced stage of exploration and other critical minerals needed for the shift to clean energy. These resources are essential for Europe, for instance, to advance in the de-risking agenda and secure the supply needed for its energy transformation. Mining, which today accounts for $4 billion in annual exports, could exceed 16 billion annually by 2033. So another big resource, the name is Vaca Muerta. I don't know if you heard about it. It's the second country with largest shale gas resource in the world, fourth country with the largest shale oil resources in the world. And the year 2024 represented a historic milestone for the energy sector with a superávit of 5.66 billion, in sharp contrast to the 13 years deficit recorded between 2011 and 2023. In addition, there is Argentine's strategy for liquefy natural gas, LNG, by 2030, where it expects to export around 40 million cubic meters per day through 4 liquefaction ships. The energy sector could generate more foreign exchange of $36 billion by 2033, when transportation infrastructure works are completed. So, as already mentioned, international organizations like the IMF project a significant recovery for the Argentine economy in 2025, highlighting a GDP growth of 5.5%, positioning Argentina among the fastest growing economy globally. GDP growth is expected to be driven by increasing consumption, investment, and the recovery of key sectors. A significant reduction is expected in the inflation rate, projected between 18% and 23% per year, following a decline from 211% in 2023 to 118% in 2024. In the labor market, the unemployment rate is expected to fall from 7.2% in 2024 to 6.3% in the current year and to 6% in the next one. So in conclusion, the stabilization policies implemented by the President Milei have drawn a lot of attention, in part because they are inspiring the ideas of liberal thinkers. As I said, this includes a strict fiscal adjustment, the elimination of foreign currency exchange control, and a sustained disinflation strategy. These measures have contributed to an improvement of investor confidence and boost economic activity. As can be seen, based on the economic program initiated in December 2023, inspired by the ideas of individuals' economic freedom, which has unleashed the country's productive forces, the Argentine economy is stabilizing and entering in a cycle of growth that will benefit the Argentine people. We can therefore affirm that von Hayek's ideas find in Argentina economy, policy, and its concrete and visible results an additional confirmation of their full meaning and validity in the 21st century, showing the concrete economic results they lead to when followed in a sensible and well-designed economic program. Thank you so much. Can I stay? Yes, sure.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the speech about Argentina. So I suppose the thing that stands out most about the current government in Argentina is, I think I'm right in saying that it's the first government run by an anarcho-capitalist, an actual legitimate, full-on libertarian. I mean, we've had, obviously, very free market governments in the past. We might associate with Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan or so on. But I think it's fair to say that Javier Milei is the most outspoken adherent of probably Austrian economics, frankly, but libertarianism more generally. So perhaps we kind of start with that. What the panel's general reflections are on how long is it? 2.5 years now that we've had the Javier Milei's 1.5.
It seems more, but it's only 1.5 years.
1.5 years. So perhaps some general reflections on 1.5 years of, a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian president.
Well, deregulation, squeezing out inflation, getting investment in, cutting taxes, more competition, encouraging innovation. I mean, what is there not to like about this program? I think that the squeezing out of the inflation is the most important thing, because the trouble with inflation, as Hayek points out, is when you've got prices are rising all the time, you can't see in that noise the signals of when some prices are going up and some are going down, because they're all going up. And therefore, people don't make rational investments in an inflationary world. And first thing that Mrs. Thatcher did when she came into office in 1979 in the UK is to clamp down on inflation. And it was very painful, but it's essential if your economy is going to recover. So I think that is a massive improvement. And I'm interested as well by the spending cuts, which are on a very large scale. And arguably, I think that's probably the right way to do it. If you try to cut things a little bit at a time, you might succeed in cutting a little bit, but then everybody else in the public sector will gang up against you. So, Elon Musk is not so far from wrong in trying to cut the bureaucracy across the board, and I think probably trying to cut public expenditure in general. It's got to be done in one big go, or you won't do it at all.
Professor, what are your broad thoughts on the new government? Well, not so new government in Argentina.
Well, I follow it with great interest. I spent half my time actually in South America, half of the time in Reykjavik, Iceland, and half the time in Rio de Janeiro, the winter time in Europe, and obviously, therefore, I follow what's happening in Argentina as well. I've been there many times, and I have many friends there. I really hope this succeeds. I've been surprised at the very little resistance that I've observed in Argentina against the very radical restructure of Argentinian society. There must be more than I have seen, but probably the left became so demoralized because of repeated failures that they couldn't do much about it. Then, additionally, Milei is not a typical right-wing politician. He is a populist, but he is a populist who combines his appeal to the population with a well-thought-out radical program. So my only wish is, the jury is still out, that he will succeed.
Ambassador, maybe you could say something about how the policies have been received domestically in Argentina. Obviously, Milei won quite substantially, I think, the vote. But it had, the previous government for a very long period had been at least centre-left, some might say left-wing, it's open to debate, but and then they switched to a government that is quite libertarian in nature. I'd love to know what you think of the response to the policies after they've been implemented.
Well, maybe during the speech was not mentioned that the another important issue in Argentina is that we have a very strong democracy nowadays. So the President Milei took office with a very important support from the population, and his ideas and measures are an expression of the majority in the country. That's why I believe that the program is working. And at the same time, Argentina is an amazing country, so plenty of resources with 45 million inhabitants, with a good market, lot of natural resources, high level of education. So I believe that, as the professor mentioned, the inflation was a very painful illness that we suffered a lot, and with the measures that quickly and rapidly implement the current government and could stop this dynamic, that horrific dynamic. Now everybody is thinking in how we can make our country better, develop good projects, invest in energy, in artificial intelligence. As Melissa mentioned, I am expert in nuclear cooperation. Argentina is one of the is the only country, developing country with nuclear industries, and a lot of people they don't know about our profile. So I believe it's a good moment to show that these measures are working and that we have a lot of opportunities to receive investments, to produce good products, to be part of the international scenario, to be a good ally for the key players around the world, as President Milei expressed, and I mentioned with the EU, with the United States, of course, and other important countries and markets.
I mean, we've pretty much spent this morning talking about the trade policies of the Trump administration and so on, and we'll get to them. I think they're important to discuss, especially with regard to Latin America and Argentina in particular. But one of the aspects of the Trump administration that has not been as, I don't know how you put it, heterodox focused when it comes to free market economics has obviously been Elon Musk's Doge operation. I think Mr. Musk has gone back to Tesla, but he did, to my mind, he did some quite extensive things in the federal government while he was there, and I think he's left behind a team. I don't know if Musk, somebody can correct me if they do know, but I don't know if Musk explicitly cited the Argentinian example as being an inspiration for what he was trying to do there. But I definitely got the sense that the people who were cheering him on were often posting Javier Milei memes with a chainsaw on Twitter and so on. So it was very clear that the energy there at some level was being inspired by Argentina. So perhaps we'd give our reflections on the Doge program in general, but also how I think it found some inspiration from what was going down south of the United States. Perhaps you'd like to start, Dr. Butler.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think that one of the reasons, possibly the main reason, behind the rise of your president and indeed Trump and Brexit and lots of other non-standard parties in Europe and elsewhere is that populations have become fed up with the political process, that they believe that the established politicians are not delivering for them, and that the government is growing bigger and bigger, and taxes are getting larger and larger, and most importantly, that laws and regulations over their lives are getting more and more dense and difficult to navigate. And it's, as with the chainsaw, many people think enough's enough, let's cut this back. And so I think that's a very widespread feeling in the world today, and it's a result of the democracy that we have. Democracy is a good way to decide things that you can't decide by any other means, but politicians tend, and the people who lobby politicians tend to make it expand beyond its natural limits and beyond its genuine limits. So then you get government interfering in all sorts of parts of individual life, and people get fed up with it and they demand something new. So I think that is the thinking behind these things, and I think that probably, yes, that Elon Musk is perfectly well aware of the experience of leaders from Mrs. Thatcher onwards who've tried to cut back the state, and Reagan and all the rest of it. Some have succeeded and some have failed. And the ones which have succeeded tend to be the ones which are actually the most radical and do things in one go so that you don't create enemies along the way, that it's a massive program It's very difficult, sometimes very painful while you're doing it, but at the same time, everybody can look beyond that and say, yeah, well, if the government was out of the way on this, then we could do all of these things. And so people start looking more optimistically to the future. And I think that Elon Musk is perfectly well aware of all of that.
Professor, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the spirit of Buenos Aires.
Well, I just support Milei and hope that he will not encounter sufficient opposition that his reforms will be stopped. This has happened before, but as Imam Butler pointed out, we have had actually examples of successful liberalization, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. There was Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, and Sir Roger Douglas in New Zealand, and Pinochet in Chile. All of them very successful economically. And in some ways, politically, Mrs. Thatcher had the longest tenure of any prime minister in England. Then we had a new wave of liberalizations in the 1990s with Mart Laar in Estonia and Václav Klaus in the Czech Republic and Leszek Balcerowicz in Poland. All of these were successful, not always politically, but economically. All had to go when their policies became unpopular, but the successors did not change the policies because they were the only policies available really to change the communist countries into free societies. So I think that there is some doubt in Latin America because we have seen that the liberal reforms in Chile, for example, there has been a return to the bad old ways in many aspects of Chilean society. However, the left lost the referendum on a new constitution where they wrote in all kinds of absurd claims to other people's money. As you know, the 11th commandment should be, thou shalt not do good with other people's money. And left-wingers are extremely good if they are spending other people's money. And the whole constitution of Chile, the new constitution, which was put into a referendum, it was voted down. So that was a victory, but there were also defeats in Chile and also in other countries in Latin America, like Peru and elsewhere. We have the return of left-wing populism, which nourishes on hatred of rich people and of gringos, and that's not at all a good and desirable development. However, I would add that there is nothing against good populism like the one Milei implements, because the devil shouldn't always have the best tunes.
I think there's another effect as well, Hannes, which is that people do actually respect and vote for a leader who knows where they're going. And that this was certainly true of Mrs. Thatcher in my country, that I think probably 2/3 of the British public hated Mrs. Thatcher, but they still voted for her because she had a clear vision of where she was going. And I think that is probably true in Argentina as well, that you have a leader with a clear sense of vision, and that is worth an awful lot of votes to an election.
Ambassador, I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of the broad Argentinian-American relationship under Trump. Obviously, as I said, the main point of inspiration, I think, has been the Doge program with Elon Musk and so on. But of course, President Milei has been a very pro-American, explicitly pro-American president. I'd just like to maybe hear some reflections on that.
Well, President Milei expressed many times and many opportunities that he believes is the alliance with the United States is the best. And he is very well connected in that line with business and in political intention. So I believe that this alliance is good. At the same time, Argentina sell to the United States market a lot of products. We have a previous connection. It's not something that is new, but the emphasis that President Milei is doing is very important, is remarkable, but at the same time we had the recent meetings around Mercosur and the EU, as I mentioned, and I believe that the idea is, of course, to find the way to have an excellent international relations network that allows Argentina to flourish. No? That the idea is just to recover our position, our historical position in Latin America, and as I mentioned before, have a remarkable growth of our economy and increase our GDP and our trade. But the connection between the current government and the United States is privilege size and priority size, and that's the line we as a diplomat follow, and that's the objective, the main line of our government.
Thank you. I suppose that brings the Liberation Day, it begins to crawl through the window again. Obviously, we're discussing trade policies and so on this morning. I think Argentina is a really interesting case for a new world in which tariffs may or may not be taking place. Obviously, even prior to the Milei government, Argentina's been very stitched into global markets and so on, and it sells an awful lot of soy actually to the Chinese market, for example. That's become a huge product, but I think that's a microcosm of Latin America in general. Latin America is trading both with its northern neighbour and it's also trading with the Pacific region quite intensively. So perhaps we'd like to think maybe a little bit about what the shifts in global trade, or at least the shifts in rhetoric around global trade, mean for Latin America in general and Argentina in particular, if anyone has any thoughts on it.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I mean, one of the effects of Trump's tariffs would be to make countries look more to their own backyards. And, so in South America, we're talking Mercosur, Pacific Rim countries coming together more, possibly the EU being even a more concentrated bloc, but China opening up ASEAN and relations with the BRICS and things like that. So the worst thing is that the world would dissolve into a number of protectionist blocs. But I'm an optimist, and as I say, I do believe in the resilience of free trade, and I think that things will bounce back. I don't know how long the present policy of the US administration will last. It may not last certainly beyond the Trump administration itself, and then we might be in a much more open world. So who knows? I mean, I'm certainly trying to help economic growth in Argentina by drinking a lot more Malbec.
Professor, you said that perhaps some solutions to some of the problems with trade and so on were regional free trade arrangements and so on. And obviously, again, Argentina in general, but Latin America in general is on two sides of the world, very much more so than perhaps a European country or a North American country like Canada or something like that. So where do you see them fitting in your global picture?
I think that free trade areas or trading blocks are not mutually exclusive. And I'll just give you one example. Lord Dan Hannan has proposed a free trade bloc with the closest, culturally closest countries with the United Kingdom, namely Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And he goes further and says that in these uncertain times, perhaps they could form a military alliance using the nuclear capability of the United Kingdom and with Canada, Australia, New Zealand helping with the finances, because keeping a nuclear defense mechanism is very, very expensive. Now, this is an interesting idea, and I have spoken to Lord Hannan about Iceland, my little country, being included in this alliance. It would be very good for us. But this is not, this does not mean that, for example, Australia and New Zealand couldn't have a trading bloc with Indonesia or with some other countries in Asia. Distances have diminished because of technology. That's quite true. So such an alliance that is being envisaged by Dan Hannan between those 4 countries, because they are culturally very close. They are about, they are all built on the British heritage, and he hopes, obviously, that then the United States would join. But this does not foreclose anything else. And the problem with the European Union is that they tend to be a closed state rather than an open market. The European Union should open its tariff borders and do free trade with other trading blocs. So even if there would be some trading blocs, it wouldn't be a danger if they are not mutually exclusive.
Ambassador, I'd love to hear your reflections, or perhaps even the government's own positions, if people aren't aware of it, on the current trade war in general, and perhaps on issues surrounding China and so on in particular.
Brazil, you mentioned, sorry?
No, sorry, the trade war in general, and maybe China in particular, given the trade linkages to Latin America.
As I mentioned before, international trade is a very delicate balance, if you see from each country. So the globalization makes the world very interdependent, as the expert mentioned before. And we need to work with a lot of intelligence, not to be controlled by emotions, and try to keep in mind that our national interest is the first goal that we have to follow, and of course provide the best for our people. So as a representative of a country, I have to say we have business, Chinese investment in Argentina. We have a loan with China. So, of course, the line, as I mentioned before, the President Milei feel very comfortable with the U.S. administration, but we live in this world and we have to deal and try to keep very clear our principles, our priorities, and our people. So I believe this will be the way we are going to work in the future.
Thank you. We have just 10 minutes nearly, so perhaps I'll open it up to the floor if anyone has any questions. If not, I can ask something. Oh, we do, at least one.
Your neighbor, Brazil, had also suffered with the hyperinflation several times in her history, and she has a success too. If you could compare the economic policy of the two countries, and other question is that what is the comparison, the economic cooperation and economic trade situation in the Mercosur between Brazil and Argentina?
Sure. Well, to compare, I am a diplomat, so I will try to do my best. I don't like to make a comparison between Argentina and Brazil because I am not an academic or analyst. But what I would like to share that Brazil is our principal partner. It's the trade between Argentina and Brazil is enormous. The interaction between people is really, really important. So maybe if the two countries, the two governments could fight, people will exchange without the government, because it's a reality. So Mercosur is it's a big tool for us. Brazil is a huge country. It's a huge market. And for instance, we have an alliance in nuclear field that show how deep is our connection. Of course, nowadays, President Milei and President Lula, they don't share a lot of, they don't have a common vision probably about the world, but countries, we are neighbors and friends, and people work and exchange goods every day. So I believe that it will be continue, and we will work together to find markets as a Mercosur, for instance, with EU. So that's the way that I am seeing the relationship, even when there are some differences between the governments.
Since Brazil came up, can I just ask, because I'm actually not clear on the current position of the Argentinian government, is the potential for BRICS membership now off the table? Is that finished?
Sorry?
The potential for BRICS membership, is that finished?
The potential for?
BRICS. There was the Argentinians under the previous government, I think, expressed
BRICS,
interest.
The BRICS. Okay, BRICS. Well, you know that to enter to a BRICS was a last-minute decision from former governments, and one of the first measures that took the current government was to withdraw from BRICS. So I believe that my personal way of seeing this, that we needed more time to analyze if we wanted to be part of BRICS or not. And I believe that the current situation, the international context with the war between Ukraine and Russia, with a lot of things involving members of the BRICS, I believe that it's not a good time to decide about the participation of Argentina in BRICS. But it's my opinion. Maybe tomorrow my boss, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the President decide another thing. But it was at the end of an administration and was the first decision. And I believe the war was a very important situation that make President Milei to withdraw from BRICS.
So it's still an open question in Argentina?
I don't know. I am working here in Hungary, and I don't know, really, I don't know if it's a part of the agenda that my ministry is studying or not. But apparently, no. What we are receiving is the line with the U.S., to work for the Mercosur-EU agreement, and BRICS is not in our agenda.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No, one more question we have time for, if there is. Oh, we have one? No. Does anyone else have a question?
Right here.
Here.
Well, first, a quick observation. Milei's party won the recent local elections, came out very well, so I think the continuing popularity is there. But since you were asked about Brazil, let me ask just a broader question about South America. Is there any evidence or any indication that other countries are looking at the success of Milei's agenda and how quickly the economy rebounded? Or is there any likelihood that other countries, probably not Brazil, but other countries might copy Argentina?
Well, Ecuador has had a recent election, and the president is near to the same line of President Milei, but you know it's difficult to see like a lot of similarities because each country has its own problems. Each president has his own personality, but I am not seeing other countries because the elections are not in this year, but Ecuador has had recently an election, and the president is in the same line of President Milei.
Do you want to say something?
What I would say on that, Dan, is that lots of think tankers around the world like me are looking at these experiments because we really do need to demonstrate evidence that our kind of thinking works. And you can talk theory to people all day, but as we say, an ounce of practice is worth a pound of theory. That you need the hard cases and to be able to show, yes, it did actually work. When we squeeze out inflation, we cut public expenditure, things did actually start booming again. So I think those are very important lessons for everybody, not just country administrations.
I would like to point out two other areas where trade might be the solution and not a problem at all. And they are the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel. The war in Ukraine is basically about Russia not allowing Ukraine to join the West. Well, how can we make a compromise there? Although I agree that, of course, Ukraine should be free to join the West. That's my opinion. But that is not enough to convince the Russians. I think that perhaps the least worst solution would be to accept that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO and the European Union, but that Ukraine might join the European Economic Area. And the European Economic Area is consisting of Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, and they have access to the internal market of the European Union, but are not a part of the European Union. That's a kind of a solution that might be possible and might be agreeable in the end to the Russians, and this would enable the Ukrainian economy to be westward. I'm a bit surprised that people haven't seen this as a possibility. Now, the other area where trade might be the solution is in Israel. Hamas has to be defeated, just like the Nazis had to be defeated in 1945. We don't have a ceasefire with the Nazis in February 1945 and allow them to govern Schleswig-Holstein or Berlin or something. That was not on. The Nazis had to be defeated. And we have to defeat Hamas. But after that, enormous possibilities can be opened up of trade and mutual assistance between the Arab states and Israel. Because Israel possesses technology, especially technology in how to make deserts into profitable and productive areas. And the Arab countries, they have capital that they have to really turn into something renewable in the future because they cannot rely on oil wells. So there are a lot of possibilities of trade between Israel and the Arab states. So you can see that the paradigm of trade could be applied both in Ukraine and in Israel to reduce the slaughter of human lives and to create peace and prosperity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thanks for coming, Ambassador. Thank you for your speech. And thank you all for joining us. I think Melissa's going to give some closing remarks or instructions.
Yes, I wanted to thank you all so much. Your excellent moderator, Philip, Professor Girason from Iceland, Dan Butler from the UK, the lovely Ambassador of Argentina from right here in Budapest, Dan Mitchell from the US, and Dr. Barbara Colm from Austria. We really appreciate you all being here. So this concludes the English portion of the program today. There's going to be a break now. You go have a lunch, and then for those who wish to rejoin us at 1:30, we'll be starting a joint program in Hungarian, in Magyar, with the American-Hungarian Chamber of Commerce of New York. So thank you. Could you please join me in applause for our panelists?